The train whistle was a long, mournful sound that cut through the endless, dry expanse of the Wyoming Territory. It was a sound of arrival, but for Josephine Finch, it felt like the closing of a door. The air inside the car was thick with coal smoke, sweat, and the smell of dust that had worked its way through every crack and seal. Outside, the world was a flat, sun-baked brown, a harsh, endless canvas that seemed to swallow the sky. She sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap. Her dress, a deep blue lace, had been fine once. Back east, now. The lace was worn thin at the cuffs, and the color was faded by a sun she had never been meant to endure. It was her last good thing, and she wore it like armor. Around her, the other passengers murmured. They had been whispering about her for the last 100 miles. They saw the dress, the proud set of her chin, and the way she met their stares with a cool, direct gaze that polite women were not supposed to possess. They saw a woman sent west without a chaperone, a woman being delivered like a parcel. They whispered the word attitude. They whispered prideful. They whispered trouble. Josephine heard them. She had been hearing whispers all her life. Back home in Philadelphia, they said she was too bold, too free with her opinions, too quick with her mind, too unwilling to bend her neck. A woman who read books on botany and politics instead of romance novels was a woman who would come to a bad end, or, in her case, be shipped to Wyoming to marry a man she had never met, a man who had paid for her passage and corresponded not with her, but with the uncle who was desperate to be rid of her. The train groaned, steel scraping steel, and shuddered to a halt. The sign on the small, wind-scoured depot read Cheyenne. This was it. She gathered her single, worn carpet bag, took a steadying breath, and descended the steps. The platform was a chaos of men in dusty hats, rough-looking women in calico, and stacked crates. The wind hit her immediately, pulling strands of dark hair from her neat bun and whipping her skirts against her legs. It felt wild, and for a half-second, a strange, fierce joy flickered in her chest. Then she saw him. He was not hard to spot. He was the only man on the platform who was not moving. He stood near the station master's office, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a severe black suit that looked out of place against the raw timber of the town. He watched the passengers disembark, his eyes scanning them with an air of impatient ownership. As her feet touched the dusty boards, his gaze locked onto her. He did not smile. He simply nodded, a short, sharp gesture, and began walking toward her. "Miss Finch," he said. It was not a question. His voice was as hard and flat as the land around them. "Mr. Withers," she replied, refusing to lower her eyes. This was Earl Withers, her betrothed. He was older than his letters had implied, perhaps 40. His face was weathered, but not in the way of the cowboys she saw. Theirs was a dryness from sun and wind. His was a hardness, as if his features had been set in cold iron. His eyes, a pale, flat blue, were the coldest things she had in all her life ever seen. They assessed her, from the worn lace to the set of her jaw. "You are taller than I expected," he said, his tone one of mild disapproval, as if she had failed a primary inspection. "And you are precisely as I expected," Josephine said, her voice clear and even. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, tightened his thin mouth. He took her bag from her hand, his grip firm, proprietary. "The wagon is this way. We have a long ride. My ranch does not tolerate idleness, and we have wasted half the day on your arrival." He led her to a buckboard wagon. There was no offer of a hand up. She grasped the iron rail and pulled herself onto the hard wooden seat. Earl Withers tossed her bag in the back, untied the horses, and climbed up beside her. He did not speak again for the first hour of the ride. The Withers ranch was carved out of the wilderness, not with love, but with sheer, brutal force. The main house was large, built of thick logs, but it had no porch, no paint, no softness. It was a fortress against the elements. Barns and corrals spread out behind it, all built for function, not comfort. As they pulled into the yard, a half-dozen men stopped their work to watch. They were a rough collection of sunburned faces, sweat-stained hats, and dusty clothes. "These are the hands," Earl said, his voice carrying across the yard. "They will show you respect as the lady of the house. You will not concern yourself with them. Your duties are inside." Josephine looked at them, one by one, her gaze steady. They shuffled, some touching the brims of their hats, others just staring openly. Then her eyes landed on one man who was separate from the others, leaning against the anvil of the blacksmith's forge. He was younger than Earl, perhaps her own age, maybe a few years older. He was wiping axle grease from his hands with a rag. He, too, was watching her, but his gaze was different. It was not hungry or curious. It was quiet, observant. He didn't look away when she met his eyes, but he didn't challenge her either. He just saw. She noticed two things about him at once. He had a pronounced limp when he pushed himself upright, his left leg dragging slightly, and down his right arm. From the rolled-up sleeve of his chambray shirt to the back of his hand ran a thick, puckered scar, the skin pulled tight and shiny, the color of old wine. It was a burn, a terrible one. "That one is Mason," Withers said, noticing her gaze. He lowered his voice to a dismissive growl. "He's my wrangler, barely speaks, damaged goods, but he works hard enough for his keep." Mason turned away, picking up a hammer, and the other men went back to their chores. The moment was over. It did not take Josephine long, perhaps only the space of that first supper, to understand the truth of her situation. Earl Withers did not want a wife. He did not want a partner. He had purchased, for the price of a train ticket, an obedient servant. The inside of the house was as stark as the outside. It was clean, meticulously so, but bare. The furniture was heavy, dark, and uncomfortable. There were no pictures, no curtains, no rugs. "Mrs. Gable, my last housekeeper, passed from lung fever," Earl explained as he showed Josephine to a small, cold room at the back of the house, separate from his own. "Your duties will be to manage the house, prepare my meals, and see to the mending. You will be silent at meals unless spoken to. You will not leave the ranch without my permission. You will not countermand my orders to the hands. Do you understand these terms?" He spoke as if dictating a contract. Josephine stood in the center of the small room. It held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single wooden chair. "I understand what you have said, Mr. Withers," she said carefully. "Good," he replied. "Supper is at 6. I expect it to be on time." He turned and left, closing the door firmly behind him. She sat on the bed, the thin mattress crinkling. She had not expected love. She had not even expected kindness. But she had, perhaps foolishly, expected a partnership, a chance to build something new, to use her mind, to escape the suffocating smallness of her life back east. She saw now that she had only traded one cage for another, this one larger, but with a much colder jailer. The clash came, as she knew it must, 3 days later. She had spent those days in a blur of exhausting, unfamiliar work. Cooking for a man with a heavy appetite, scrubbing thick wooden floors, washing heavy denim and canvas. But her mind was restless. She found herself watching the operations of the ranch from the kitchen window. She had read books. She understood crop rotation, feed mixtures, animal husbandry. She saw waste. She saw inefficiency. That morning, she was hanging laundry on the line when Earl gathered the hands to give orders for the day. He was instructing a young hand, barely a boy, to mix the feed for the new calves. Full measure of corn, half of barley. Earl commanded. Josephine paused, a wet shirt in her hands. She knew from her reading that corn-heavy feed was too harsh for unweaned calves. especially in a dry climate. It could make them sick.
Mr. Withers,
she said, her voice carrying in the clear morning air. Every man stopped. Earl turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. It was the first time she had spoken to him in front of his men.
I read in a treatise from Cornell University,
she continued, her heart hammering but her voice steady,
that a mash of oats and molasses with just a little corn is better for young calves. It fattens them faster and prevents sickness.
The silence that followed was absolute. The wind kicked up a small dust devil in the corral. The young hand looked terrified. Earl Withers walked slowly toward her, stopping just a foot away. He was so tall he blocked the sun.
You,
he said, his voice dangerously soft.
Read a treatise.
Yes, Josephine said, lifting her chin.
It was by Professor Roberts.
He argued that,
You will be silent,
Earl hissed. He did not shout. The low, venomous command was worse than any yell. You are a woman. You know nothing of my stock. You know nothing of my ranch. Your world is that house. He pointed a thick finger toward the kitchen. You will never, ever contradict me in front of my men again. You will never contradict me at all. You will learn submission, Josephine, or you will learn pain. I am a man of discipline. I will have an obedient wife. He turned to the petrified young hand. You will feed them as I said, corn and barley. Josephine stood frozen, the wet shirt dripping onto the dust. She could feel the eyes of all the hands on her. She felt the heat of humiliation crawling up her neck, a sickening, familiar feeling. But she would not cry. She would not run. She would not lower her gaze. She watched Earl stride back to the barn. Then, slowly, she turned and pinned the shirt to the line. Across the yard, Mason was shoeing a horse. He had not looked up during the entire exchange, but as she turned back to her basket, she saw him. He was watching her. His face was, as always, unreadable, but his eyes were not cold like Earl's. They were dark, and they were steady. He held her gaze for a single, long second, then turned back to the horse's hoof, his hammer ringing against the steel. He was the only one who hadn't looked away from her shame, and somehow it had felt less like an intrusion and more like a simple, silent statement. He had seen it. In the days that followed, Josephine learned the shape of her new life. It was one of isolation, hard labor, and a tense, simmering silence. Earl spoke to her only to give orders or to find fault. Her contributions were met with silence, her mistakes with sharp, cutting rebukes. But she began to notice small things. The water pump was at the main well, 100 yards from the kitchen. It was her job to haul the water for cooking, cleaning, and laundry. The twin buckets were heavy, and the wooden yoke cut into her shoulders. The hands would watch her struggle, some offering smirking comments just quiet enough for her to hear, just loud enough to be an insult. One afternoon, she was halfway to the house, her shoulders screaming, her hands raw. She paused to switch her grip. As she did, a shadow fell over her. It was Mason. He said nothing. He simply reached down and took the yoke from her shoulders. The sudden relief made her stumble. He balanced the yoke on his own broad shoulders, his limp slightly more pronounced under the weight, and walked ahead of her. He set the buckets on the kitchen stoop, turned, and walked back toward the barn without a single word or a backward glance. It happened again a few days later. A new colt, skittish and wild-eyed, had been put in the small breaking corral. Josephine, finished with her morning chores, found herself drawn to it. She leaned on the fence, speaking in a low, soft voice she had not used since she arrived. The colt's ears twitched. It took a hesitant step toward her. She heard the scrape of a boot behind her and whirled, expecting Earl, her heart leaping with fear. It was Mason. He was holding a bridle. He stopped when she turned, as if not meaning to be seen.
I was just,
she stammered, feeling like a child caught stealing. Earl had forbidden her from the corrals. Mason just looked at the colt, then at her. He held out the bridle. Josephine looked at it, confused. He gave a small nod toward the horse. Then he walked to the corral gate, his boot dragging in the dust, and lifted the heavy wooden latch. He swung the gate open just enough for her to slip inside, and then he walked away, leaving her alone with the horse. It was permission. It was trust. It was, she realized, the first gesture of kindness she had received since stepping off that train. On Sunday, Earl took her into the settlement for the church service. It was, she knew, not for her soul, but for his reputation. A man of his standing must be seen with his new wife. She wore her one other good dress, a simple gray wool. As they walked toward the small white chapel, she could feel the stairs. The women of the town were gathered by the door, a small flock of hens, their heads bent together. As Josephine approached, they fell silent, their eyes dissecting her. The preacher's wife, a thin, bird-like woman named Mrs. Albright, stepped forward, her hand outstretched. Her smile was pasted on. "Mrs. Withers, we are so very glad you have settled." Her eyes raked over Josephine, noting the worn fabric of her dress, the way she did not smile or bob her head. "Thank you, Mrs. Albright. The country is very bracing," Josephine replied, her voice polite and cool. Mrs. Albright's smile tightened. "We are simple, God-fearing folk here, Mrs. Withers. We value humility. We value a quiet spirit. I'm sure you will learn our ways in time." The implication was clear. She was not humble. She was not quiet. "I find I learn new things every day," Josephine said. A whisper started as she and Earl passed into the church. "So proud. That's the one they sent from the east. No wonder her family sent her away." And then, from one of the women, loud enough to be heard, "She's too bold. A woman like that is dangerous." Josephine sat on the hard wooden pew, her back ramrod straight, her eyes fixed on the plain cross at the front. She felt the stairs on her back like a physical weight. She was truly, completely alone. That night, the desolation settled on her. In her small, cold room, she let down her heavy dark hair. The ritual of brushing it, 100 strokes, was all she had left of her old life. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in her thin nightgown, the brush pulling through the long strands. The silence of the house was heavy. The wind moaned outside, a lonely, crying sound, and it broke her. The tears came silently. They were not for Earl. They were not for the whispering women. They were for Thomas. The memory, always waiting in the shadows, rushed in. Her brother. He had been 14, full of fire and laughter, and just as bold as she. Their father, a man of cold rages and heavy hands, had despised them for it. He had sought to cure them of their spirit. She remembered the last night, the rain, the bag they had packed with bread and cheese and her mother's locket. They were going to run. They were going to be free. But their father had been waiting. He had come home early, his voice thick with liquor and righteousness. He had found the bag. He had grabbed Thomas. Josephine could still feel the slick, wet wood of the floor under her cheek, her father's boot on her back holding her down. She could still hear the sickening, dull thud of his belt buckle striking her brother. She had screamed, begging him to stop, screaming that it was her idea. But he hadn't stopped. Not until Thomas was quiet, not until the fire and laughter were gone, leaving only a small, still body on the floor. "You see," her father had panted, his chest heaving. "What rebellion brings?" Josephine's hand tightened on the hairbrush, her knuckles white. She had failed him. Her boldness had not saved him. It had gotten him killed. And her punishment was this: to be sent away, to be forgotten, to be owned by a man who was just a different kind of monster. She lowered her head, and a sob, a dry, ragged sound, tore from her throat. She pressed her face into her hands, muffling the sound.
She would not be heard. She would not give Earl the satisfaction. She cried quietly, her shoulders shaking in the dark, the grief a cold stone in her gut. Mason made his last rounds late. The ache in his leg was bad tonight, a deep throb that matched the rhythm of his limp. He checked the horses, the latches on the barn, the water troughs. His last stop was to check the wood pile by the main house. He walked past her window. It was cracked open, just an inch, to fight the stuffy air in the small room. He heard it. It was not a loud sound. It was the quietest, most terrible sound in the world. It was the sound of someone trying to cry without making a single noise, a choked gasp, a desperate swallow. He stopped in the shadows. He stood for a long time, listening. He had heard men cry like that on the battlefield, after the noise and the blood, when they thought no one could hear them. It was the sound of a spirit breaking, and trying not to. He knew what Earl Withers was. He knew what this place was, and he had seen her face that morning, when Earl had cut her down in front of them all. He had seen her stand tall, but he had seen the wound. He looked at her door. He could knock. He could offer a word. But what word? He had none, and knocking would only bring her shame, to be discovered in her grief. He turned and limped back to the bunkhouse. The other men were asleep, their snores filling the room. He went to his own bunk. Under it, he had his spare blanket. It was not a rough army issue, but a soft, thick wool blanket he had won in a card game years ago. It was dark blue, warm, his one small piece of comfort. He pulled it out, folded it neatly, and walked back to her cabin. The night was cold. The wind was picking up. He stood at her door. The quiet sobbing had not stopped. He bent down, his bad leg protesting, and set the folded wool blanket on the rough bench just outside her door. He set it down gently, making no sound. He hesitated for only a second. Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness, his uneven footsteps fading into the sound of the wind. When Josephine woke the next morning, the gray light of dawn barely visible. Her first feeling was the cold. The fire in her small stove had died, and the chill of the high plains had seeped through the chinks in the logs. She shivered, pulling her thin nightgown tighter, and rose to dress. That is when she saw it. Draped neatly on the bench just outside her door was a dark blue wool blanket. It was thick, soft, and bore the faint, clean scent of tobacco and horse. She stopped, her hand on the door latch. She looked left, then right. The yard was empty. Save for the first plumes of smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, who had left it. It was the quiet wrangler, Mason. He had heard her. He had heard her grief, the sounds she had tried to smother in her hands. And his response was not scorn, not pity, but comfort, a simple, silent offering against the cold. She pulled the blanket inside, her fingers tracing the soft wool. She wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a stark contrast to the cold iron grip that had defined her life since her arrival. For the first time, she did not feel entirely alone. It was a dangerous feeling. But Josephine Finch was not built to surrender. Her father had tried to break her, and failed. Her uncle had tried to discard her, and she had endured. Earl Withers would not be the man to succeed. She would make the best of it. If this was her prison, she would learn the shape of its walls. She threw herself into the work of the ranch house. She had always been smart, and she was observant. The sour, heavy bread Earl's last housekeeper had baked was replaced by a lighter loaf. Made with a potato starter she managed to coax to life. She reorganized the root cellar, taking stock of the dwindling supplies, calculating exactly how long they would last before the next trip to town. She was efficient. She was tireless. She was trying to earn her keep, to find some small measure of peace. And she learned the horses. She started by simply talking to them over the fence, the way she had with the colt. Then, finding a new confidence after Mason had left the gate open for her. She began to slip into the corral when Earl was gone, checking on the stock. She learned their tempers, which one favored a soft hand, which one respected a firm voice. She had a touch. The animals, so often tense and jumpy around the rough hands and Earl's demanding presence, seemed to quiet for her. This excellence, however, only seemed to curdle Earl's temper. He found no fault with the meals, but he would complain that she used too much flour. He did not deny the house was cleaner, but he accused her of wasting lye soap. And when he saw her mending a saddle blanket, her stitches neat and strong, his lip curled. "That is a man's work," he said, snatching it from her hands. "You are not a hand. You are my wife. Attend to your kitchen." Her competence was not a virtue. It was a challenge. He wanted a broken thing, and she stubbornly refused to break. The more she excelled, the more he watched her, his cold blue eyes filled with a simmering displeasure. He was a man who owned things, and she was a thing that was not behaving as it should. The true break came, as it always does, over a small matter that was not small at all. It was Sunday, 2 weeks after her arrival. The day was already hot, the air still and heavy. Earl, dressed in his severe black suit, stood by the door, tapping his boot impatiently. "You are not ready," he stated, his voice flat. Josephine emerged from her room. She wore her gray wool, the only other dress she had. It was brushed and clean. "I am ready, Mr. Withers." He looked her up and down. His gaze was clinical, inspecting. "No, you are not. Go back and put on your foundations." Josephine stiffened. "My foundations?" "Your corset," he clarified, as if speaking to a dull child. "You will not appear in God's house looking like a loose woman. You will present yourself as my wife." Josephine's hands clenched at her sides. Back east, the whalebone contraption had been a daily misery. Here, in this heat, where she hauled water and scrubbed floors, it was an absurdity. It was a tool of confinement, and she had not worn it since the day she arrived. "It is too hot, Mr. Withers," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I cannot breathe properly in it to begin with. In this weather." "You will do as you are told." "No." The word was out before she could stop it. It hung in the air, sharp and bright as glass. "It is a vanity, and it is suffocating. I will not wear it." Earl Withers did not move for a long moment. The silence in the main room was absolute, broken only by the buzz of a fly against the window pane. He looked at her, his face a mask of cold disbelief. She had defied a direct order. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply raised his hand, his arm moving with a swift, brutal economy, and struck her across the face. The sound was sharp, ugly. It snapped her head to the side, and the shock of it stole her breath. Her cheekbone exploded with a sharp, stinging pain. She tasted blood, where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip. She stood perfectly still, trembling not with fear, but with a white-hot rage that threatened to consume her. She slowly turned her head back to look at him. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She just stared at him, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost cold. "I will have obedience," he whispered. He pointed to her room. "You will stay here. You will not eat. You will reflect on the sin of defiance." He turned, put on his hat, and left for church, a righteous man alone. Josephine did not move until she heard the wagon rattle out of the yard. Then she walked on unsteady legs to her room and locked the door. She touched her cheek. It was already swelling, the skin hot and tight. She had been hit before. Her father had used his fists. But this was different. This was the blow of an owner. She spent the day in that room. The house was silent. The sun beat down on the roof, turning her small space into an oven. She did not cry for Thomas. She did not cry at all. She sat on her bed, the blue wool blanket in her lap. and let the hatred harden. The next morning, her cheek was a map of ugly purple and yellow. She did not try to hide it. She pulled her hair back tightly, splashed her face with cold water, and went to the kitchen to build the fire for breakfast. She expected Earl to be triumphant. Instead, he was silent, eating his biscuits and bacon with a cold indifference, as if nothing had happened at all. The mark on her face was her badge of submission. He had won. She was scrubbing the greasy skillet when a shadow fell across the kitchen door. She looked up, her hand tightening on the rag. It was Mason. He stood on the stoop, his hat in his hand. His eyes flicked to her bruised cheek, then quickly away. He did not register shock or pity. He just registered the fact of it. He looked, as always, like a man who had seen worse. He said nothing. He simply held out a coiled piece of leather. It was a saddle, a small, lightweight side saddle. Clearly old, but the leather was clean and oiled. Josephine stared at it. "Hey, Mr. Withers," he said. "He's taking the hands to the south pasture," Mason said. His voice was rough, like stones rolling together. "Unused. They'll be gone till sundown. The bay mare is gentle. She's tied by the gate." He did not hand her an apron. He did not offer her salve for her face. He offered her an escape. He offered her the one thing Earl sought to deny her: freedom. He set the saddle down on the stoop, turned, and limped away toward the barns. She rode out that day. The bay mare was gentle, just as he had said, and Josephine, despite her city upbringing, had a natural seat. She rode until the ranch house was just a speck, until she was surrounded by nothing but the rolling brown hills and the enormous, aching sky. The wind pulled the pins from her hair and it streamed behind her, a dark banner. She felt, for the first time, the brutal beauty of this land. It was not a cage, it was an ocean. She began to ride every chance she got. Mason never spoke of it, but sometimes she would find the bay mare already saddled. It was a silent conspiracy. Her skill grew, and with it, a sliver of her old self returned. This work, the work with the horses, it felt right, it felt real. The tension on the ranch was pulling tighter. The other hands saw her riding. They saw the bruise fade. They saw the way Earl Withers watched her, and the way Mason, in his silence, seemed to watch them all. The roundup was set for the end of the week. It was a massive effort, bringing in cattle that had strayed miles across the open range. The air was thick with dust, the screams of men, and the bawling of frightened calves. Josephine was not meant to be part of it. She was tasked with preparing a mountain of food for the exhausted men. But she stood on the porch, watching. A group of men were trying to separate a young steer from its mother. The cow, wild-eyed and protective, was charging anything that came near. A young hand, the same one who had almost fed the calves the wrong grain, got his horse too close. The cow charged, the horse reared in panic, and the boy went flying. The horse, its reins flapping, bolted, blind with terror, straight for a deep, rock-strewn gully. "Damn it!" one of the older hands yelled, starting to uncoil his rope. "He'll break his legs for sure!" "Let him go!" Earl shouted from across the corral. "We haven't got time for one spooked horse. Get that cow!" But Josephine was already moving. She did not think. She ran from the porch, vaulted onto the bay mare that was tied nearby, and kicked her into a gallop. She angled across the yard, her body low, her hair flying, and cut the panicked horse off before it reached the gully. It swerved, its eyes rolling white. The men were yelling at her now, Earl's voice loudest of all, but she did not listen. She pulled her mare alongside the frantic animal, matching him stride for stride. "Easy," she said, her voice low and calm, projecting under the noise. "Easy now. You are all right. Shh. You are all right." She did not grab for the reins. She just kept talking, that same steady, soothing murmur she had used on the colt, on the bay mare. The horse's stride began to slow.
Its ears twitched, catching her voice. He slowed from a bolt to a canter, then to a rough trot. Josephine kept pace, still talking, until finally the horse stopped, blowing hard. Its flanks lathered in sweat, but its panic broken. She reached over, took its reins, and slowly led it back to the corral. The yard was silent. The hands just stared. The young boy she had saved the horse for was dusting himself off, his face red with shame. Earl Withers was riding toward her, his face a thundercloud. But before he could reach her, she passed Mason. He was leaning on the corral fence, his arms crossed. He had watched the entire thing. He looked at her, and his face was still, but his eyes were not. He gave her one short, sharp nod. It was a nod of respect, a nod from one horseman to another. Earl reined his horse in so hard it danced sideways. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" he roared, his public mask of control gone. "You get back in that house. You are not a man. You are not a cowboy. You are my wife, and you will learn your place, or I will teach it to you." He fumed, furious that she had succeeded where his men had failed, furious that she had acted like a man. Josephine's hands were shaking. She slid off the mare, her legs weak. She handed the reins of the panicked horse to the young hand and walked back to the house, her chin high, refusing to look at any of them. She found Mason later, in the barn, rubbing down the bay mare. The air was warm and smelled of hay and leather. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching him. His movements were efficient, his scarred hand surprisingly gentle on the horse. "Thank you," she said. He did not look up, but his hands paused in their work. "For the saddle," she clarified. He just grunted, a small acknowledgement. She stepped inside. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty. It was full. "Why do you do it?" she asked, her voice soft. "Why are you kind?" He stopped rubbing and turned his head. His eyes were dark in the shadows of the barn. "Kindness is cheap. A man ought to spend it." She looked at this quiet, damaged man. The limp, the scarred arm, the silence. "Why do you never talk, Mason?" He turned back to the horse, picking up a curry comb. He ran it over the mare's flank. He thought about her question for a long time. She was about to turn and leave, thinking he would not answer. "Because I listen," he said, his voice low. "Most folk, they talk so much they forget how. They talk over the things that matter. They tell you what they want you to think they are. But when they're quiet, you hear what they are." He paused, his hand resting on the mare's back. "You hear the truth." Josephine felt a strange tightness in her chest. He listened. He had heard her grief. He had heard her intelligence. He had heard the truth. He listened to her, and she realized, was listening to him. A few days later, he found her by the creek bed, where she had gone to gather watercress for the evening meal. He approached so quietly she did not hear him until he was right there. He held something out to her. It was a book. It was small, the leather cover so worn it was soft as cloth. The corners were bent, the pages yellowed. She took it from his hand. The title was stamped in faded gold, A Flora of the Great Plains. She opened it. Inside were detailed drawings of wildflowers, prairie grasses, and herbs. In the margins, in a neat, faded pencil script, were notes. Good for horses' lungs. Boil this root for fever. Found near Medicine Bow. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice barely audible. "She liked plants, like you." Josephine's fingers traced the drawing of an Indian paintbrush. He had remembered. The treatise, the livestock feed. He had seen her, not as Earl saw her, not as the townswomen saw her, but as she was, a person with a mind. She looked up at him, and her throat was so thick she could not speak. A tear, hot and sudden, escaped her eye and rolled down her dusty cheek. She wiped it away, angry at her own weakness.
He saw it, but he did not shame her for it. He just stood there, patient. "No one has ever," she started, but she could not finish. "It's just a book," he mumbled, looking uncomfortable. He touched the brim of his hat and limped away, leaving her holding the gift. She kept it hidden. It was a dangerous secret, a connection she could not afford. She kept it under her thin mattress, pulling it out at night, reading the familiar Latin names and the unfamiliar, handwritten notes. It was a lifeline. But secrets, on a ranch this small, have a short life. Earl had been in town, drinking. She could smell it on him when he came into the house. A sour, sharp smell. He was in a foul mood, his movements jerky and angry. He watched her serving his supper. His eyes narrowed. "You're mighty quiet tonight," he said. "I am always quiet, Mr. Withers." "No," he said, slamming his fork down. "You are smug. You think you are better than me, with your books and your horses." He stood up and strode to her small room. She flew after him. "Mr. Withers, do not!" He kicked the door open. He did not search. He seemed to know exactly where to look. He flipped her mattress, and the small leather book fell to the floor. He stared at it. Then he looked at her, his face dark with a possessive, ugly rage. "His," he hissed. "You let that filth give you gifts." "It is a book about plants," she cried, lunging for it. He was faster. He snatched it up. "It is a token. You are flirting with my help. You are shaming my name." "No, it is just a book." "It is filth, and so are you." He grabbed the book in both hands, and with a grunt of pure malice, he ripped the leather spine in two. The pages, brittle with age, tore and scattered across the floor. Josephine screamed. It was a raw, broken sound. It was as if he had torn her own skin. "You will learn," he panted, his chest heaving. He threw the ruined halves of the book at her. "You will learn who you belong to." He shoved her, hard, into the room. She stumbled and fell. Before she could get up, he slammed the door and she heard the heavy, metallic thud of the outside bolt sliding into place. He had locked her in. She lay on the floor, surrounded by the torn pages of a dead woman's memories, and she wept. She did not know how long she lay there. The house was silent. Earl had likely gone back to his whiskey. The moon rose, casting a pale, cold square of light on the floor. Then she heard it, the faint scrape of a boot in the dirt outside her door, followed by a thump, as if someone had sat down, their back against the wood. She crawled to the door, pressing her ear against the plank. She could hear someone breathing, a slow, steady rhythm. It was Mason. He did not knock. He did not speak. He just sat. He was guarding her. He could not fight Earl, not without a gun, and that would be murder. He could not break down the door, but he could stay. He could be a witness. He could make sure that Earl did not come back. Sometime, in the deepest part of the night, she heard a small clink of metal on the floor. She looked down at the crack under the door. A tin cup of water had been pushed through, just far enough for her to reach. She drank, her throat raw. He did not leave. She sat on her side of the door. He on his. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. She heard the bunkhouse stir. She heard the other hands waking up. And then she heard him stand. His knees cracked in the cold air. He did not walk away until he heard Earl in the main house, stoking the fire. Only then did his uneven footsteps fade toward the barn. He had stayed all night. The gossip spread through the settlement like a prairie fire. The hands talked. They had seen it all. They had seen her ride. They had heard Earl's rage. They had seen Mason sitting vigil outside her door. They told their wives. Who told the mercantile owner? Who told Mrs. Albright? The story twisted. Josephine Withers was not a victim. She was a Jezebel. She was too proud to be a wife. She was too bold, riding around like a man, and now she was seducing the help, She was shaming her husband, a good, disciplined man, by tempting his crippled wrangler. Josephine felt the change immediately. When she rode to the general store with Earl, he would not let her out of his sight now. The women turned their backs. The men watched her with a new, unwelcome assessment in their eyes. She was no longer just the proud new wife. She was the fallen one. The next Sunday, Earl forced her to go to the church social. It was a test. He wanted to see her humiliation. He wanted her to feel the eyes. She wore the gray dress. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. She walked into the small churchyard, holding a plate of biscuits she had been forced to bake. The chatter stopped. Mrs. Albright gave her a smile that was all teeth and judgment. Mrs. Withers, the preacher's wife said, her voice loud enough for all to hear. We are so glad you found time to join us. I trust you are finding your duties more to your liking. My duties are what they are. Mrs. Albright, Josephine said. She stood alone by the refreshment table. A pariah, a younger woman, one of Mrs. Albright's circle, approached her, holding a steaming cup of tea. Oh, Mrs. Withers, the woman cooed, her eyes bright with malice. You look so warm. Let me help you with that. And she tripped, stumbling forward, dumping the entire cup of scalding hot tea directly into Josephine's lap. Josephine cried out, a sharp gasp of pain as the hot liquid soaked her wool skirt and stung her legs. She jumped back, dropping her plate of biscuits. The woman giggled. Oh my, how clumsy of me. I am so very sorry. There was a ripple of muffled, cruel laughter. Earl stood across the yard, watching, a small, satisfied smile on his face. This was her penance. Josephine stood there, shaking, her skirt dripping, her skin burning, utterly alone in a circle of grinning wolves. Here, the voice was low, and it cut through the laughter like a knife. Mason stepped through the crowd. He was not supposed to be here. This was a social gathering, not for the hired help. But he had been in town, picking up feed, and he had seen... He stood in front of her, blocking her from the others. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were hard. He held out a clean, blue handkerchief. Josephine stared at it, her vision blurry. The crowd was silent now, shocked by his intrusion. Mrs. Albright looked scandalized. Mason looked at the tea staining Josephine's dress. He looked at the women. He looked at Earl, who was no longer smiling. He pushed the handkerchief into her hand, and then he spoke, his voice not loud, but a low murmur that seemed to carry across the entire yard, reaching every ear. Bold suits her, he said. He turned, his limp more pronounced as he pushed back through the stunned crowd and walked away. The ride back from the church social was a long, vibrating line of silence. Josephine sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her skirt still damp and smelling of spilled tea. The burn on her legs was a dull throb, a small pain compared to the raw, public humiliation. Earl Withers did not speak. He did not look at her. He just drove the wagon. His jaw set so tight a muscle jumped beneath the skin. Mason's words, "Bold suits her," echoed in the dry air. It had been an act of war. A crippled, silent wrangler had drawn a line in the dust, and he had drawn it on her side. When they reached the ranch, Earl got down from the wagon, tied the horses, and walked into the main house without a word or a backward glance. He did not help her down. Josephine sat there for a long minute, watching his back. The public humiliation had not been enough for him. His wife had been defended, not by him, but by a hired hand. His authority, his ownership, had been challenged in front of the entire town. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would make her pay for it. That night, the drinking began in earnest. Before, Earl had been a man of discipline, even in his cruelty.
Now, that discipline began to crack. He no longer hid the whiskey bottle in his study. He brought it to the supper table, setting it down next to his plate like a second utensil. His rage, once cold and controlled, became hot and unpredictable. He would sit at the table, drinking, just watching her. His cold blue eyes, now bloodshot, would follow her every move as she served his food. As she cleared his plate, he was looking for a flaw. He was looking for an excuse. He started small. He found fault with the bread, crumbling it in his fist and throwing it on the floor. "It's dry, like you." He would accuse her of wasting firewood, of looking at the hands, of being slow. He was baiting her, trying to find that spark of boldness he so despised, so he could have a reason to crush it. Josephine responded with a terrifying, numb silence. She cleaned up the bread. She added no wood to the fire. She kept her eyes on the floor. She was surviving. She remembered her father. She knew this game. But the silence, her refusal to break, only made him angrier. He was a man poking a sleeping animal with a stick, furious that it would not wake up and give him the satisfaction of a fight. The inevitable finally happened on a Tuesday. He had been drinking since noon, supposedly going over the account books, but she could hear the clink of the bottle and his low, angry muttering from the main room. She was in the kitchen, washing the supper dishes, her hands raw from the harsh lye soap. He came in, unsteady on his feet. He smelled of sweat and sour whiskey. "You left the gate on the small corral open," he said, his voice thick. "No, Mr. Withers," she said quietly, not turning around. "I have not been to the corrals today. It was one of the hands." "You are lying." He stepped closer. She could feel the heat of him at her back. "You were out there, talking to him, talking to that cripple." "I was not. I was mending your shirts." "You think I am a fool," he hissed. He grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. The soap-slick plate in her hand slipped, fell to the floor, and shattered. They both stared at the broken porcelain. "Look what you did," he whispered, his voice a mockery of calm. "You are careless. You are wasteful. You are defiant." "This was it, the excuse." "It was an accident," Josephine said, backing up until she hit the cold wood of the kitchen counter. "There are no accidents," he said, advancing on her. "Only insubordination." He raised his hand, the one he had used to slap her. She flinched, but this time, she also did something else. She put her hands up, a small, useless gesture of defense. That was the move that broke him. It was not submission. It was a fight. He did not slap her. He hit her. His closed fist, heavy and hard, caught her high on the cheekbone, just under her eye. The world went white, then black, filled with sharp, exploding stars. The force of it threw her sideways against the wall. She slid down to the floor, stunned, her ear ringing. A hot, metallic taste filled her mouth. Iron, blood. He stood over her, panting, his chest heaving. He looked down, not with satisfaction, but with a strange, detached curiosity, as if studying an insect he had crushed. "I will have obedience," he said, as if it were a prayer. He turned, walked back to the main room, picked up his whiskey bottle, and went into his own quarters. He did not slam the door. He closed it softly. Josephine lay on the floor for a long time, the pieces of the broken plate cold against her skin. She did not cry. The pain was a dull, heavy throb that seemed to come from far away. She touched her face. Her eye was already swelling shut. She had failed. Her father had beaten her, and now her husband had beaten her. This was her life. The chores, however, did not wait for grief. The sun would rise. The fire must be built. The water must be fetched. She rose before dawn, her body stiff and aching, in the small, cracked mirror over her washstand. She saw the damage, Her left eye was a swollen, grotesque slit, the skin around it a dark, ugly purple. Her lip was split. She looked like a monster. She looked like her mother used to look. She bathed her face in cold water, wincing as the cloth touched the broken skin. She pulled her hair back severely, took a deep, shuddering breath, and went out into the gray light of the yard to fetch the water. She hoped no one would be awake. She just wanted to get the water and hide in the kitchen. But Mason was there. He was always there first, checking the animals before the other hands were even awake. He was at the pump, filling the troughs. He saw her. He stopped, his hand on the pump handle. He did not move. He just watched her limp, hesitant approach. The morning light was merciless. It showed him everything. The swollen, shut eye, the dark purple stain that spread down her cheek, the cut on her lip. Josephine's first instinct was to hide, to turn and run, but she was so tired of running. She stopped a few feet away from him, clutching her empty buckets. She had to say something. She had to control this. "I am very clumsy," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I walked into the pantry door, in the dark." The lie was flimsy, pathetic. A child could see through it. Mason looked at her face. He looked at the ugly, violent mark. Then he slowly, deliberately, turned his head and looked at the main house, at the closed door of Earl Wither's room. His jaw tightened. The scar on his arm seemed to pull, the skin growing white around the old burn. He was making a calculation. She could see it in his eyes. He did not acknowledge her lie. He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not say anything. He simply reached out and took the empty buckets from her nerveless hand. He worked the pump, his movements stiff, the muscles in his back and shoulders rigid with a cold, contained rage. He filled both buckets to the brim. He set them down, and then he walked away, back to the barns, his limp heavy in the dust. His silence was an accusation, and it was a promise. He knew. He could not challenge Earl. Not head on, that would mean a gun, and that would mean a hanging. A crippled wrangler against a rich rancher, there was no justice in that. So, he began his own silent campaign. 2 days later, the swelling on her face had turned a sickly yellow, the pain a constant, dull companion. She was chopping wood for the kitchen stove, a task she despised. The axe was heavy, and her vision was blurry on one side. She missed the block, the blade burying itself in the dirt. She heard a boot scrape. Mason was there. He did not speak. He held out a small, round tin. "What is it?" she asked, her voice suspicious. "Comfrey," he said. His voice was rough. "My mother used it, for bruises. It helps." She stared at the tin. He had given her a book. Now he was giving her medicine. He will be angry if he sees it," she whispered. "Then do not let him see it," Mason said. He set the tin on the chopping block, not forcing it on her, but leaving it for her. He picked up the axe she had dropped, with one smooth, powerful swing. He split the log she'd been struggling with. Then he split another, and another. In a minute, he had created a neat pile of kindling. He set the axe down, its blade sharp, and walked away. That night, in her room, she rubbed the cool, dark green salve onto her bruised cheek. It smelled of earth and herbs. It was the first true tenderness she had felt in her life. His help continued. They were small, invisible things. She went to her cabin door, the one with the hinge that always squealed, the one that announced her every coming and going. It was suddenly, miraculously, silent, oiled. She went to the grain bin to get feed for the chickens, and the heavy lid, which always took all her strength to lift, now rose easily on a new leather strap, acting as a pulley. He was fixing the broken things. He was making her life easier, one silent, repaired object at a time. He was caring for her in the only way he knew how, in a language of deeds, not words. The other hands noticed. Of course they did. A ranch was a small, bored world,
And this drama was their theater. The tension in the bunkhouse grew. Mason, always a loner, was now an outcast. One evening, Josephine was walking past the bunkhouse and heard the voices, rough and sharp. "Gettin' mighty neighborly with the boss's wife, ain't ya, Mason?" It was a young, cocky hand named Red. "First, it's handkerchiefs. Now you're her personal handyman. What'd she give you for it?" There was a snicker of laughter. "Shut your mouth. Red," another voice said. An older man, Silas, the one who had been there for years. "He's gonna get himself shot." Red pushed on, his voice loud. "Withers catches him sniffing around. He'll—" The sound of a chair scraping back. Silence. Then Silas's voice, low and serious. "You best watch your step, son. All of you. A man like Withers, he don't like his property being looked at. He's got a jealous streak a mile wide. And you," he said, his voice dropping, clearly addressing Mason. "You're limping right into it. She ain't worth a bullet." Josephine pressed her back against the wall, her heart hammering. She waited for Mason's reply. There was none, only the sound of him oiling a piece of tack, the steady, rhythmic shush of the rag on leather. His silence was his answer. He was not afraid. She hurried back to her cabin. Silas was right. Mason was putting himself in danger. For her, she should tell him to stop. She should run. She sat on her narrow bed, her hands clenched. Run where? Back east, to her uncle who despised her, to a city, with no money, no skills but what she had learned here. She would be a prostitute or a scullery maid within a week. And then there was the other, harder truth. She was tired of running. She had tried to run with Thomas, and it had killed him. She would not let Earl Withers win. She would not let him drive her out. This was her home, even if it was a prison. She would stand her ground. She felt under her mattress. Her fingers found the small, sharp paring knife she had hidden there. It was not much of a weapon against a man like Earl, but it was a comfort. It was a promise to herself. She would not be a victim again. She would not let him win. The confessions came a week later. The air had the dry, electric feeling of approaching autumn. The shared secrets between them, the salves and the silent repairs, had built a strange, fragile bridge. She found him in the barn, mending a bridle. The bay mare, her mare, was in the next stall. The barn was their church, their only safe place. She did not know how to start. She just stood there, watching his scarred hands work the leather. "Silas, he is right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You should not help me, Mr. Withers. He is a jealous man." Mason did not look up. "A man ought to do what he thinks is right." "Even if it gets him killed?" "Some things are worth it." He pulled a stitch tight, his movements economical. She looked at his scarred arm, at the way his leg rested at an odd angle. "The war?" she asked. He nodded. "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes, when the cold comes." "You are a good man, Mason." He stopped working. He set the bridle down and turned to look at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "No, I ain't. Good men do not do what I did." "What did you do?" He looked away, out the barn door, at the flat, endless land. He was silent for a long time. She thought he would not answer. "I shot my commanding officer," he said, his voice flat. Josephine felt her breath catch. "We were outside Atlanta," he said, his voice distant, as if reciting a story he had told himself 1,000 times. "The commander, he was a man who liked killing. He was drunk. He ordered us to fire on a farmhouse. Said they were spies. But I'd seen them. An old man, a woman, 2 little girls. They were just farmers. Hiding." He picked up the bridle again, his hands needing the work. "I refused the order. He called me a traitor. He drew his pistol on me. To make an example, I was faster. I shot him, right in the chest, saved the family." "That is not a crime."
Josephine breathed.
That is bravery.
The Army calls it murdering a superior officer, Mason said, his voice hard. They held a court-martial. I was in a military prison for 6 months. In irons. That is where the limp comes from. The irons. They were going to hang me. But a general, he read the report. He knew the commander. He knew what he was. He commuted it. Dishonorable discharge. He spat on the ground. So, no, I ain't a good man. I am just a man who got away with it. He had shared his deepest, darkest secret. A silence filled the barn, heavy with his truth. Josephine knew she owed him one in return.
You think you are a bad person,
she said, her voice shaking.
You saved people. I killed a man.
My father killed my brother.
Mason went utterly still, his head snapped up, his eyes locking on hers.
She had never said the words aloud.
Not to anyone. His name was Thomas,
she said, the words tasting like ash.
He was 14. He was like me, bold. My father, he hated us for it. He called it curing us of rebellion.
He used his hands, his belt. She was shaking now, the memory so vivid it was happening all over again. We were going to run away. I had it all planned. He found our bag. He came home early. He was drunk. She looked at Mason, her eyes wide with the horror of it. He grabbed Thomas, and he held me down. He made me watch. He used his belt, the heavy buckle. He beat him. He just kept hitting him. I screamed. I told him to stop. I told him it was my fault. But he wouldn't stop. Not until he was quiet. A single tear tracked down her bruised cheek. He beat him to death, to cure him, and then he looked at me, and he said, "You see what your boldness brings? My uncle, he shipped me out here because he could not stand to look at me. I was the one who was left. I was the one who got him killed." She was sobbing now, the dry, ragged sobs he had heard through her window. Mason did not move. He did not comfort her. He did not touch her. He just saw her. He saw the truth, all of it, the guilt and the grief and the rage. He saw the girl who had survived a monster, only to be sent to another one. The storm broke 2 nights later. It was not a gentle rain. It was a Wyoming thunderstorm, a gully washer, a raw explosion of power. The sky ripped open. Rain came down in solid, driving sheets. Lightning lit the world in stark, blue-white flashes, and the thunder was not a rumble, but a cannonade, a physical blow that shook the house. Earl was in the main room, drinking. The storm made him mean, his temper as raw as the weather. He paced the floor, cursing the rain, cursing the cattle that would be scattered, cursing her. "This is your fault," he slurred, pointing at her. "You bring a curse on this house. You are a cancer." Josephine could not breathe. The house was too small, his rage too large, the memory of her father. The sound of the belt, it was all mixing with the sound of the thunder. She had to get out. She did not care about the rain. She did not care about the lightning. She grabbed her shawl, wrenched the door open, and ran. She ran, blind, into the deluge. The rain hit her like needles, soaking her to the skin in seconds. She ran to the only safe place she knew, the barn. She burst inside, the smell of wet hay and animals overwhelming. She collapsed onto a pile of hay, her back against a stall, and she finally, truly, broke. She put her face in her hands and wailed, her sobs lost in the roar of the storm. She did not hear him enter. She only knew he was there when a flash of lightning illuminated him, standing near the door, dripping wet, his hat in his hand. He was checking on the horses, afraid the storm would spook them, and he had found her. He did not speak. He did not approach. He just sat, a few feet away. He leaned his back against the same stall, so they were separated by the wood, but sharing the same small space. They sat in the dark, 2 drenched, broken people. The barn was an island in the screaming chaos of the storm. The horses shuffled nervously in their stalls. Josephine's sobs slowly quieted, turning to hitched, shuddering breaths. She was so cold, so tired. "He is wrong," Mason said, his voice quiet, but it cut through the sound of the rain. She turned her head, though she could not see him in the dark.
"What?"
"Your father, and Withers, and them women in town." Another flash of lightning. She saw his profile. His face was wet, his hair plastered to his head. He was looking out the open barn door at the rain. "I have been watching you," he said, "since the day you got here, in that fancy dress." He turned his head, his eyes finding hers in the darkness. "You ain't too bold," he said, his voice soft, but rough as gravel. "You are just not afraid to be seen." The words hit her like a physical touch. He had not just listened. He had understood. He had taken her shame, her guilt, her sin, and he had reframed it. It was not a flaw. It was her strength. Their eyes met and held. For a long, silent moment, the world stopped. The thunder faded. There was only the sound of the rain and their breathing. She looked at him, really looked at him. The scarred arm, the bad leg, the quiet, steady eyes. And she saw, for the first time, desire. But it was not the cold, possessive hunger she saw in Earl's eyes. It was not the cheap, leering curiosity of the ranch hands. It was something else. It was a quiet, burning fire. It was a desire that did not want to own her. It did not want to take her, or break her, or even fix her. It was a desire that simply wanted to stay, to sit with her in the storm, to be seen, right alongside her. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and raw. The air was sharp, smelling of wet dust and pine. Josephine had not returned to the house. She had stayed in the barn, wrapped in the bay mare's blanket, and had fallen into a hard, exhausted sleep in the hayloft. Mason had not left, either. He had stayed on the ground floor, checking the animals, his presence a silent guard. When the gray light of dawn crept in, she came down the ladder. He was there, by the open barn door, looking out at the weak sun. He had his hat on, his back to her.
"Mason,"
she said, her voice rough from sleep and crying. He turned. He did not seem surprised. He looked at her, at the hay in her hair, at the exhaustion on her face. "He will be awake," she said. "I know," he replied.
"I am not," she paused. "I am not afraid of him."
"I know," he said again, and a small, almost invisible smile touched his mouth. They stood there, just talking, about the horses, about the small creek that had jumped its banks. It was nothing. It was everything. They were two people, standing in a barn doorway, talking as equals. The air between them was quiet, comfortable. It was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened on that ranch. And, of course, that was when Earl saw them. He was walking from the house to the corrals. He stopped, 20 yards away. He saw his wife, her hair a mess, standing in the barn with his crippled wrangler. He saw the way they stood, not touching, not close, but together. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He began to walk toward them, his steps measured, heavy in the mud. Josephine saw him. Her body went rigid.
"Earl."
Mason turned. He saw him, too. Mason's hand dropped to his belt, but there was no gun there. He took a step, placing himself slightly in front of Josephine. Earl did not even look at Mason. His pale, cold eyes were fixed only on her. He did not stop until he was close enough to smell the hay on her clothes. "You," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hiss. "You come with me." "We were just talking about the—" Josephine began. He did not let her finish. He reached out and grabbed her, not by the arm, but by her long, unbound hair. He wrapped his fist in it, yanked, and pulled her off her feet. She screamed, a sharp cry of pain and shock. He began to drag her, stumbling, across the muddy yard, toward the main house. "No!" Mason roared. He lunged forward, Grabbing Earl's shoulder, Earl, without even turning, swung his other arm back, his elbow connecting hard with Mason's ribs. The force, combined with Mason's bad leg, sent him sprawling into the mud. Earl did not pause. He just kept walking, dragging Josephine by the hair, her hands scrambling at his wrist. "You are my wife," he panted, the words ugly. "You are my property. You will learn." He dragged her up the steps, across the porch, and threw her into the main room. She crashed against the table, sending a chair flying. "You will stay here. You will not leave this house," he shouted, his face purple with rage. He slammed the door, the whole house shaking. Josephine lay on the floor, shaking, her scalp on fire. She heard Mason get to his feet in the yard. She heard his voice, low and terrible. "Withers!" "You come near this house, cripple!" Earl shouted through the door. "And I will shoot you for trespassing!" Josephine crawled to the door. She heard Mason hesitate. He could not win. He had no weapon. It would be a slaughter, after a long, agonizing silence. She heard his uneven footsteps walking away, back toward the barn. She got to her feet. She looked at the door. Her hand went to the heavy iron bolt on the inside, the one he had used to lock her in, the night he tore her book. Her hand closed around it, and she slid it into place. She locked him out. That night, she refused to speak. He rattled the knob. He banged on the door. "Josephine, open this door." She sat in her small, cold room, the blue wool blanket wrapped around her. She said nothing. He shouted, he threatened, he called her names, finally defeated by her silence. He went to the bunkhouse to sleep. She had taken the main house. It was her fortress now. The next morning, Mason rode into town. He did not ask for permission. He just saddled his horse and went. The ranch hands watched him go. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "He is a dead man," Red, the young hand, said with a nervous laugh. "Maybe." Silas, the old hand, replied, not looking up from his coffee. "But he will not be the only one." Mason rode to the general store in Cheyenne. He bought a 50-pound sack of flour, a side of bacon, and a small bag of coffee. Then he walked to the counter. "Mr. Albright," he said to the preacher's brother, who ran the store, "I need a rifle." "A rifle? Mason?" the man asked, surprised. "You already got a new one," Mason said, his voice flat. "A Winchester, centerfire, and 2 boxes of cartridges." He paid in cash from a small leather pouch. He did not say another word. He loaded his supplies, slid the new, gleaming rifle into his saddle scabbard, and rode back to the ranch. When he rode into the yard, every man stopped working. They saw the rifle. It was not a tool for hunting coyotes. It was a message. The ranch was buzzing. Mason had just declared war. Josephine had to confront Earl. She could not stay locked in the house forever, but more than that, she saw what was happening. She had seen this before. A man's pride, a woman's defiance, and she knew how it ended. It ended with her brother's body on the floor. She would not let Mason die for her. She unbolted the door. She found Earl in his study, staring at his account books, a bottle at his elbow. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, surprised to see her. She was pale. Her eye was still bruised, but she was not cowering. "He bought a rifle." She said it was not a question. "He did," Earl said, a cold smile touching his lips. "Foolish." "You have to let me go," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "I will not be the cause of this. I will not have his death on my conscience." "His death?" Earl laughed, a short, ugly bark. "His death will be on his conscience. He is challenging my authority. He is touching my property." "I am not your property." The words exploded out of her, the truth she had held in for so long. "You do not own me, and you do not own my voice." The smile vanished. He stood up slowly. "What did you say?"
I said, she repeated, her chin high. You do not own my voice. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He slapped her. It was a hard, ringing blow, just as before. It snapped her head back. But this time, she did not stumble. She took the hit, and her eyes, when they met his again, were not filled with fear. They were filled with fire. He saw it. He saw that the violence had not worked. He saw that she was truly unbroken. So he changed his tactic. He grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into the bruise, forcing her to look at him. You are right, he whispered, his voice terrifyingly soft. I do not own your voice, but I own your life. And his. He let her go, pushing her back. You keep speaking out, Josephine. You keep looking at him. You keep encouraging that cripple. And I will not touch you. He paused, letting the words sink in. I will kill him. She froze. I will shoot him in the gut. Earl continued, his voice conversational. Right out there in the yard. And I will tell the judge he drew on me. I will say he was mad with lust for my wife. And every man in that bunkhouse, and every woman in that town, will back me up. They will call it self-example. They will say I was protecting my home. He leaned in, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her face. His life is in your hands now. You want him to live? You go back to being the quiet, obedient wife I paid for. You keep your eyes down. You do not speak to him. You do not even look at him. You show all of them that you belong to me. Or he dies. It is your choice. He had found her cage. He had found the bars that would hold her, her own life. She would risk, but not Mason's. Not again. That night, Earl slept in the main house, in his own bed. He had won. But when he woke in the morning and looked out the window, his victory soured. Mason was sleeping outside her cabin. He had not just sat vigil, he had moved his bedroll. His saddle was there, and so was his new rifle, leaning against the wall, clean and oiled, its brass shining in the dawn light. He had not spoken to her. He had not defied Earl's threat. He had simply moved. He had planted himself, a silent, armed guardian, between her and the world. He was a physical barrier. He was saying, you will have to come through me. The Cold War had begun. Josephine saw him from her window. Her heart ached with a strange mix of terror and a fierce, burning pride. He was willing to die for her. She had to live for him. She could not speak to him. That was Earl's rule, but she could speak in other ways. She went to Earl's wardrobe. She pulled out a pair of his old work pants, the ones he no longer wore. They were too large. She found her sewing kit. She cut them down. She re-sewed the seams. She took a pair of her own, more practical, sturdy boots. She cut her hair, the long hair he had grabbed, chopping it short, to her chin, with the kitchen shears. When she walked out of the house to fetch water, she was no longer Josephine Withers, the rancher's wife. She was a different creature, dressed in men's pants, her hair shorn. She walked with a new, sure-footed stride. Mason, sitting on his bedroll cleaning his rifle, saw her. He stopped. He just watched her walk. He did not smile. He just nodded. Earl saw her. His face went white. This was not submission. This was the opposite. This was a flag of defiance. But he could not stop her. Not with Mason sitting right there, the rifle across his knees. The next trip to town was a nightmare. Earl forced her to go. He wanted to shame her. As she walked into the general store, dressed in her pants, the women gathered there, led by Mrs. Albright, acted as if she had walked in naked. There was a collective gasp. Well, I never... Mrs. Albright said, her voice dripping with venom. She has finally shown her true colors. No shame at all. She is a whore, another woman whispered, loud enough for the entire store to hear. Dressing like a man, guarded by her lover. She is a whore. Josephine stopped,
She turned. She looked at the woman who had said it. She looked at all of them. She said nothing. She picked up her sack of flour, paid Mr. Albright, and walked out, her back straight. The defiance felt good. It felt clean, but it was hardening her. Back at the ranch, the air was poison. The hands would not meet her eye. They were terrified of Earl, and they were resentful of Mason. One afternoon, the young hand, Red, saw her in the yard. He had been drinking. He felt brave. He wanted to impress Earl, who was watching from the porch. "Hey, Josephine," he called out, puffing his chest. "You like them pants, or you just like filling them for other men?" Josephine stopped. "Why do you not just go to him?" Red sneered, gesturing with his thumb toward Mason, who was 30 feet away. "Shoeing a horse. We all know you are his whore." Mason dropped the horse's hoof. He turned, his face black with rage. He started to walk toward Red. "No," Josephine said, her voice sharp. Mason stopped. Josephine walked right up to Red until she was close enough to see the poor quality of his shave. He was just a boy, a cruel, stupid boy. "What did you call me?" she asked, her voice quiet. I called you a," he stammered, his bravado fading in the face of her cold calm. Before he could finish, she punched him. It was not a slap. It was a hard, closed fist punch, delivered with all the strength of hauling water and chopping wood. It caught him square on the nose. There was a wet, crunching sound. Blood exploded. Red screamed, clutching his face, and stumbled back, falling into the water trough. The ranch was dead silent. Josephine stood there, her knuckles smarting, her hand shaking. Mason had not moved. He had not stopped her. He had let her fight her own battle. He was watching her, and the look in his eyes, it was raw, uncut admiration. Earl stormed off the porch, his face a mask of fury. He had lost all control. His violence had failed. His threats had failed. His public shame had failed. His wife was now brawling in the yard like a saloon drunk. He could not break her. So he decided to dispose of her. That night, he did not rage. He was quiet. He was calm. He sat in his study, and by the light of a single lamp, he wrote a letter. He wrote it to the superintendent of the Wyoming State Hospital for the Insane. He wrote in his neat, disciplined hand about his wife, about her fits of rage, her dangerous boldness, her delusions that she was a man, her violent episodes. He wrote that she was a danger to herself and to others. He was a concerned husband, begging for their help. He was requesting a commitment for female hysteria. He sealed the letter. He would send it with Silas in the morning. It was legal, it was clean, and it was final. Mason, sleeping on his bedroll, saw the light in the study. He saw Earl give the sealed letter to Silas at dawn, along with the mailbag. He saw Silas ride out. Mason was on his horse in minutes. He did not follow. He knew a shortcut. He cut Silas off at the river crossing. "Give me the letter, Silas," Mason said. He was not asking. His new rifle was resting in his lap. "Mason, I do not want any trouble." The old man said, his hands up. "It's just the mail." "The letter from Withers to Laramie." Silas's eyes went wide. He knew. He handed it over. "You have not seen me," Mason said. He turned his horse and rode back, hard. He did not go to Earl. He went to the barn. He knew she would be there. It was her only refuge. She was there, brushing the bay mare. She looked up when he burst in, his face pale, his limp more pronounced from his hard ride. "You have to pack," he said, his voice rough, urgent. "What? Mason, I cannot. He will. He is done trying to hurt you, Josephine," Mason said, his voice breaking. He held up the letter. "He is sending you away, to the asylum." She stared at the letter. "What?"
He wrote it all. That you are crazy. Female hysteria. He is having you committed."
Josephine's blood went cold. The asylum. That was worse than death. It was a living grave. All her fighting, her defiance. The punch, it had all just been proof for him. Proof that she was hysterical. She had lost. She had truly, finally lost. "You will not go," Mason said, his voice fierce. He grabbed her arm. "I will not let him. You hear me?" He was shaking, his terror for her plain on his face. "You will not be sent anywhere. Not while I can breathe." That was what broke her. Not the punch, not the hair pulling, not the letter. It was his loyalty. It was the fact that he was willing to burn down the world for her. She looked at this man, this broken, silent, scarred man, and all the fight went out of her, replaced by a desolation so deep it was bottomless. "Why?" she whispered, her voice tearing. "Why do you care? I am a curse. I got my brother killed. I will get you killed." She slid down the wall of the stall, her legs giving out. She sobbed, her face in her hands. "Look at me!" she cried, her voice muffled. I am nothing. I am a whore. I am crazy. Do I even matter? Do I matter to anyone?" Mason knelt in the hay in front of her, his bad knee cracking. He pulled her hands away from her face, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were burning. "You do to me," he whispered. He said it like it was the only truth left in the world. She stared at him, her vision blurred by tears. He mattered. She mattered. And then he kissed her. It was not a soft kiss. It was not gentle, or sweet, or polite. It was hard. It was desperate. It was a kiss of survival. It was the kiss of two people who had been pushed to the very edge of the world and had found one solid thing to hold on to. It was rough, and it tasted of salt from her tears, and leather, and the iron certainty that they would not die alone. That kiss in the barn was not an end. It was a beginning. It was a match struck in a powder keg. When it broke, they were both breathing hard, staring at each other in the dim, hay-scented light. The terror of the letter, the asylum, was still cold in her stomach, but the kiss had lit a fire. "We have to go," Mason said, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. He got to his feet, his bad knee stiff. "We have to go now." "Go where?" Josephine asked, her voice a whisper. "He will find us. He will send the law after me." "Idaho, Oregon, West," he said, pulling her to her feet. "Somewhere his name does not matter. He cannot send the law after you if you are not his, and you are not his." It was that simple. You are not his. "I have to pack," she said, though her mind was numb. "Get what you need," he said. "Get the blanket. We ride." He followed her from the barn. His new rifle in his hand, he was not just her guardian anymore. He was her accomplice. They moved quickly across the yard to her cabin. The ranch was quiet, the midday sun beating down. The other hands were in the north pasture, miles away. Earl, they assumed, was in his study with his bottle and his accounts. They were wrong. Earl Withers had seen Silas return. He had seen the old hand ride in, his face pale, and he had seen him unload the mailbag. The letter to Laramie was not in it. Silas, terrified, had admitted that Mason had taken it, at gunpoint. Earl's rage was a cold, white thing. It was beyond whiskey. It was the rage of a man whose property had not only defied him, but had allied with his hired help to steal from him. He had grabbed his shotgun from the wall and gone looking. He did not find Mason in the bunkhouse. He did not find him at the forge. He strode to Josephine's cabin, his boots heavy on the dirt. He did not knock. He kicked the door open. It splintered off its new oiled hinge and crashed inward. Josephine screamed. She was standing by her narrow bed, stuffing the blue wool blanket into a saddlebag. Mason was by the door, his rifle in his hand, a sack of oats at his feet. They were caught. Earl stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light. His shotgun was level. His pale eyes were no longer cold. They were burning. "Whore!" he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. He looked at Mason. "And you thieving, crippled traitor." "Let her go, Withers," Mason said, his voice low and steady. He had the rifle, but Earl had the shotgun, and his finger was on the trigger. It was a standoff. "Let her go?" Earl laughed, a raw, ugly sound. "She is not going anywhere but the asylum. And you are going to hell." He made his mistake. He thought Mason was the only threat. He shifted the barrel of the shotgun just an inch to center it on Mason's chest. It was the opening Mason needed. He did not try to lift his rifle. He lunged, moving with a speed that belied his limp. He grabbed the shotgun barrels and shoved them toward the ceiling. The gun went off. The blast was deafening in the tiny cabin. Pellets tore a hole in the roof, showering the room with wood and dust. Josephine screamed again, pressing herself against the wall. Earl roared, a sound of pure animal rage. He was stronger than Mason. He was heavier. He dropped the shotgun and drove his fist into Mason's stomach, right where his ribs were already bruised. Mason gasped, the air leaving his lungs, but he did not let go. They crashed into the small table, splintering it. They were brawling, a desperate, clumsy, brutal fight. Earl's strength against Mason's speed. "I will kill you," Earl panted, his hands grabbing for Mason's throat. Mason, his bad leg twisting under him, stumbled. Earl fell on top of him, his weight pinning Mason to the floor. Mason's head hit the wood planks with a sickening crack. Earl's big, thick-fingered hands found Mason's neck. He began to squeeze. Josephine stood frozen for one terrible second. She saw her father. She saw Thomas. She saw the life leaving Mason's face. "No!" she screamed. She did not think. She grabbed the first thing she could find, the heavy iron poker from her small, cold stove. She raised it high and brought it down with all her strength across Earl's broad back. It was like hitting a side of beef. He grunted, the sound a mix of pain and surprise, and his grip on Mason's throat loosened. He roared and started to turn, to get up, to face her. "You witch!" he spat. That was all the time Mason needed. His lungs were burning, his vision graying, but his hand was free. As Earl turned to rise, Mason drew his arm back and hit him. It was not a punch. It was a blow, delivered with every last ounce of his desperate, terrified strength. His fist connected with Earl's jaw. The sound was dull, heavy. Earl's eyes rolled back in his head. His body, which had been so full of rage, went completely limp. He slumped sideways and fell to the floor, unconscious, out cold. The silence that followed was terrifying. There was only the sound of Mason, on his hands and knees, dragging in great, ragged, whistling breaths. Blood was dripping from his nose and from a cut over his eye. "Is he?" Josephine whispered, the iron poker still in her hand. "He's breathing," Mason gasped. He crawled to his rifle, grabbing it, and used the wall to pull himself to his feet. He was a mess. His face was already swelling. His ribs were on fire, and he was favoring his bad leg more than ever. He was badly beaten, but he was alive. They stared at the unconscious man on the floor. "We have to go," Mason said, grabbing the saddlebag. "We have to ride now, before he wakes up." "No." Josephine's voice was surprisingly clear. She dropped the poker. "No, we are not running, not like this. We will be fugitives. He will say we tried to kill him. He will be right." "Josephine," Mason pleaded, "he will kill us." "We go to the judge," she said, her mind suddenly sharp. "We go to town. We tell him what happened. We tell him Earl beat me. We tell him about the letter. We show him the letter. This is self-example. We have to use the law." Mason looked at her. He thought she was crazy. He had no faith in the law, but he looked at the set of her jaw, the fire in her one good eye, and he knew he could not change her mind. This was her boldness. This was who she was. "All right," he said. "We go to the judge." They did not take the time to pack. They did not take the time to tend their wounds. They left Earl on the floor, grabbed the letter and their rifles, and ran to the barn. They saddled the bay mare and Mason's own buckskin. They rode into Cheyenne looking like ghosts, a man, battered and bloody, holding his ribs, a woman in men's pants, her hair chopped, her face a map of old and new bruises. People in the street stopped to stare. They looked like outlaws. They found the judge, a man named Hemphill, in his dusty office above the feed store. He was a portly man with a thick mustache, and he was a man who played cards with Earl Withers every Saturday night. He looked up from his desk, annoyed. As they burst in, "What is the meaning of this?" "Judge Hemphill," Josephine said, her voice shaking but strong. "I am Josephine Withers. My husband, Earl Withers, has beaten me repeatedly." The judge's eyes narrowed. He looked at her bruises. He looked at Mason, who was standing by the door, his rifle held loosely, his face a swollen mask. "And he tried to have me committed to an asylum," Josephine continued, her voice rising. "Falsely. When I am not sick, he wrote this letter." She threw the crumpled letter onto his desk. Judge Hemphill picked it up. He read it. His face did not change. He read about the female hysteria, the fits of rage. He tapped the paper on his desk. Then he looked at Josephine. He looked at her pants. He looked at her shorn hair. He looked at her bruised face. He looked at the armed, crippled man behind her. "Mrs. Withers," he said, his voice cold. "I have known Earl Withers for 10 years. He is a pillar of this community, a hard-working, God-fearing man." He slid the letter back across the desk. "You show up here, dressed like a saloon boy, with a hired hand, and you accuse your husband of what? Discipline?" "He beat me," Josephine cried. "He hit me with his fist." "A man has a right to discipline his own house," the judge said, his voice rising. "A wife has a duty to be obedient, and you—" He gestured at her, his face full of distaste. "You do not look obedient, Mrs. Withers. You look hysterical." He stood up. "As for this letter, given your condition, perhaps your husband's concerns were not misplaced." "But we fought," Josephine stammered, the cold truth dawning. He is unconscious at the ranch. We hit him." "You hit him?" The judge's face went purple. "You assaulted your own husband, in his own home, and you come here, expecting what? Help?" He pointed to the door. "I am dismissing this. I am dismissing all of it." "You cannot," Josephine whispered. "It is not justice." The judge leaned across his desk. "Justice," he said, "is that a wife belongs to her husband. Now you get out of my office, before I have you both arrested. You for assault, and him for whatever it is you two are doing." The law had slammed the door in her face. They walked out of the office, back into the blinding, indifferent sun. They were stunned, numb. There was no help, no justice, no asylum, just nothing. They stood on the dusty boardwalk, not knowing where to go. They could not go back. They could not stay here. Well, look at this." The voice was like vinegar. Mrs. Albright, the preacher's wife, was standing there, a basket on her arm. She had seen them go into the judge's office. She had waited. She had seen them come out. She looked at Josephine's face, at Mason's, and she smiled. It was a smile of pure, righteous victory. "It seems, Mrs. Withers," she sneered, her voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "that the law agrees with decent folk. A woman who defies her husband, who runs around with filth, has no place to run. You have been cast out, just as you deserve." Josephine looked at her. She looked at this woman, who had spilled tea on her, who had whispered whore and crazy and dangerous. This woman, who represented the polite society that had chewed her up and spit her out. She thought of her brother. She thought of the asylum. She thought of the judge. She had nothing left to lose. She walked up to Mrs. Albright. The woman's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "You, Mrs. Albright began." Josephine slapped her. It was not a punch. It was a clean, sharp, open-handed slap, delivered with all the force of her rage, her grief, and her broken heart. The sound cracked through the street. Mrs. Albright staggered back, her hand flying to her bright red cheek, her mouth open in a perfect, silent "oh." The street went dead quiet. People stopped. A horse whinnied. Josephine did not say a word. She turned her back on the stunned woman. "Josephine," Mason said, his voice urgent. He grabbed her arm. "We have to go. Now, we have to ride." He was right. She had just assaulted the preacher's wife. The judge would not just dismiss that. They would be arrested for sure. They ran to their horses and mounted. They galloped out of Cheyenne, not looking back. They were outlaws now. They rode hard, back to the ranch. They had no choice. They had to get their things. Their horses were tired. They needed food, water, and Mason's new rifle. When they rode into the ranch yard, the sun was setting. The world was bathed in a blood-red light. It was quiet. Too quiet. Then the ranch hands stepped out. They emerged from the barn, from the bunkhouse, from the forge, all 6 of them. Silas, red, his nose in a crude bandage. The others, they stood in a line between Josephine and her cabin. They were holding axe handles, heavy wrenches, and 2 old hunting rifles. And then Earl stepped onto the porch of the main house. He was awake. He was holding a wet rag to his jaw, which was already a swollen, purple mess. In his other hand, he held his shotgun. "You broke my jaw," he slurred, his voice thick with pain and whiskey. "You came back, you stupid bold witch." "We are just getting our things. Withers," Mason said, pulling his own rifle from his scabbard. He was injured, but he sat tall in the saddle. "We are leaving." "The only place you are leaving," Earl spat, "is in a pine box. Boys, stop them! They assaulted me! They are criminals!" The ranch hands looked at each other. They were paid by Earl. They were loyal to Earl. They stepped forward, a ragged, dangerous line. "It's over, Josephine," Earl sneered. "You are done." Mason raised his rifle. He was outnumbered, 8-1. He was badly hurt. This was where they died. But Josephine was done being afraid. She swung her leg over the saddle and slid to the ground. "Josephine, no!" Mason yelled. She ignored him. She started walking, bruised, exhausted, in her stolen pants. She walked straight toward the line of armed men. She walked right past the end of Mason's rifle. "Stop right there, girl!" Red shouted, raising his axe handle. He was eager. She stopped, 10 feet from them. She looked at Red. She looked at Silas. She looked at all of them. She was not crying. She was not hysterical. She was calm. "You are right," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the twilight. "I hit him." She pointed to Red. "And I hit her." She gestured toward town. "And I hit him." She pointed to Earl on the porch. "He beat me. He locked me up. He tried to send me to an asylum to rot, because I would not be quiet." She took another step. "He told you I was his property. He told you I belonged to him." She looked at Silas, her eyes pinning him. "But I am not property. I am a person, and we are leaving. We are going to get our things, and we are going to ride out of here. You can try to stop us. You can help him. You can try to kill us." She raised her chin, the red light of the sunset catching her bruised face. "But we will not be owned." The yard was silent. The hands looked at her. They looked at Earl, a mean, violent drunk. They looked at Mason, who had always been a quiet, steady hand. Earl raised his shotgun. I pay you. Stop her.
Red took a half step, but Silas put out his arm. The old man looked at Josephine. He saw the grit. He saw the truth. He had known what Withers was. He just had not had the courage to say it. He dropped his pitchfork. It clattered in the dust.
You've got grit, girl,
he said, his voice rough.
That's more than most.
He turned, walked to the feed shed, grabbed a heavy sack of oats, and tossed it into the dirt at her feet.
Now go,
he said, not looking at Earl. Take the supplies, and just go, before he sobers up enough to aim that thing straight. Red looked at Silas, then at Earl. He lowered his axe handle. The line broke.
Traitors!
Earl screamed, his voice cracking.
Cowards! I will fire every last one of you!
But it was over. His power was gone. The men were just staring at him, their faces empty. Josephine did not look at him. She turned to Mason. Get the things. While Mason, his rifle still ready, tied the oats in his bedroll to his saddle. Josephine walked to her cabin. She came out a moment later. She was carrying the blue wool blanket, and under her arm, a long white dress, the wedding dress, the one she had been sent here to wear, the one she had never even taken out of its box. She walked past the barn, to the ring of stones where they held the branding fires. She stuffed the white lace dress into the cold ashes. She found a lucifer in her pocket, struck it, and touched it to the fabric. The dry lace caught at once. The fire leaped up, a bright, hungry orange. She stood there, watching it burn. The fire lit her face, illuminating the bruises, the short, shorn hair, the fierce set of her jaw. Mason came and stood beside her, silent, his good hand resting on her shoulder. They watched until the white dress, the symbol of the life that had tried to suffocate her, was nothing but a pile of black, glowing cinders. Josephine turned to Mason. She said nothing. He said nothing. They mounted their horses. They did not look at Earl, who was still frozen on the porch. They did not look at the ranch hands, who were just standing, watching. They turned their horses west, toward the dark, open territory, and rode out of the yard, leaving the ashes behind. They rode west. They did not stop, except to let the horses drink and rest. They rode until Wyoming was a memory, a dark stain on the horizon behind them. They crossed the border into Idaho territory with nothing but 2 tired horses, 2 rifles, a sack of oats, a tin of salve, and a single blue wool blanket. Mason's face was a ruin of purple and black. His ribs ached with every breath, a sharp, stabbing pain that told him at least one was cracked. Josephine's scalp was tender, her own bruises a dull, throbbing counterpoint to his. They were a broken pair, but for the first time in her life, Josephine felt the air. It was cold, thin, and free, and it felt like her first true breath. They traveled for 2 weeks, following the Snake River, avoiding the main trails. They spoke little, but their silence was a shared thing, a language of necessity. He would hunt, bringing back a rabbit or a grouse, and she would cook it over a small, smokeless fire. He would clean the rifles, his scarred hands steady, and she would read the torn pages of the botany book, which she had salvaged and stuffed into her bag. At night, they took turns standing watch, though they both knew Earl Withers would not follow them this far. His pride was a local thing. His power ended at the Wyoming line. They were not running from him anymore. They were running towards something. They found it on the edge of the Sawtooth Range, a raw, new mining town called Custer. It was not a town, really. It was a scar on the mountainside, a collection of rough pine shacks, muddy streets, and a dozen saloons, all clinging to the side of a canyon. It was a place where no one cared about your past, only about the color of the ore you pulled from the ground. It was a town of men, but where there were men, there were families, laundresses and shopkeepers, all trying to scratch a living from the miners' dust. It was perfect. On the outskirts of the town, a mile up the creek, they found a ruin.
It was a trapper's cabin, built years before and long since abandoned. The roof had fallen in on one side. The door was gone. The chimney was a pile of rocks. But the 4 main walls, built of thick, solid logs, were still standing. "It is not much," Mason said, his voice rough. He looked at the ruin, then at her, his face full of apology. This was all he could offer. Josephine got down from the bay mare. She walked through the empty space where the door had been. The floor was dirt. A pack rat skittered out from the fallen stones. She looked at the solid walls. She looked at the view down the canyon, the sharp, blue peaks rising like teeth against the sky. "It is ours," she said. They began to rebuild. It was the hardest work either of them had ever done. Mason, his ribs still healing, would ride out at dawn. He took a job at the mining company's livery, wrangling the mule trains that carried the ore down the mountain. He was, as Earl had said, damaged goods. But the foreman saw the way he handled the animals, the quiet competence, the strength in his scarred arms. His limp did not matter. His past did not matter. He was paid every Saturday in cash, and every Saturday, he would stop at the town's only hardware store. He would come back to the cabin with a sack of nails, or a pane of glass, or a box of hinges. Josephine worked at the cabin. She was the architect of their new life. She cleared the fallen roof, dragging the rotten timbers out. She mixed mud and straw to chink the logs. Her hands caked and raw. She rebuilt the chimney, stone by heavy stone, her body aching at night. But it was a good ache. It was the ache of building, not of being broken. Together, in the long, cool evenings, they rebuilt the roof. Mason would climb, his bad leg making it slow, but his arms strong. He would set the new pine rafters. She would stay on the ground, passing him the shakes, one by one. They worked in a rhythm, a silent dance of partnership. He never gave her an order. She never questioned his work. They were, finally, equals. They lived in a canvas tent beside the ruin, sleeping on their bedrolls, the blue wool blanket their only luxury. They ate beans and bacon and the small, sweet onions she found growing wild by the creek, using the knowledge from her mother-in-law's book. The town did not know what to make of them. The whispers started. Of course, they always did. The miners' wives saw her. They saw the woman in men's pants, her hair cropped short like a boy's. They saw the faded bruises on her face, and the way the quiet, scarred wrangler looked at her. They saw that they lived in a tent, together, and that there was no ring on her finger. They whispered, they pointed, but here the whispers were different. They were not the acid judgments of Mrs. Albright. This was a land of hard truths. People had seen worse. People had done worse. They were an oddity, but they were survivors. Josephine did not flinch. When she walked into the general store for flour, she met their stares with the same level gaze she had always had. But the fear was gone. The shame was gone. She had nothing to hide. Her boldness, here, was just her. Mason found his place first. The men at the livery respected his silence. They called him Short Fuse because he never spoke, but they saw his skill. He could calm a panicked mule with a word. He could set a shoe in half the time of any other man. He was solid. Josephine found hers by accident. She had gone to the mercantile to buy thread. A group of children, 5 or 6 of them, were playing in the muddy street, their faces dirty, their language rough. They were the children of the miners, running wild while their mothers took in laundry or cooked for the boarding houses. One of the boys, the oldest, was trying to read a sign on a crate. He was sounding out the letters, painfully slow. Boston. Boston, Josephine said, stopping beside him. The boy looked up, suspicious. It is a city, she said, back east, a long way from here. The boy stared. You can read? Yes, she said. Can you teach me? And just like that, she had a purpose. She started with one. The next day, he brought his sister.
By the end of the week, she had 6 children. She held her school on the flat. Clean rocks by the creek. She had no books. She had no slates. She used a piece of charcoal from their fire and the smooth, white bark of the aspen trees. She taught them their letters. She taught them to add. She taught them about the plants in her book. She taught them about the world beyond the canyon. She was good at it. Her mind, so long suppressed, was sharp and bright. The children, starved for knowledge, adored her. She was strict, but she was kind. Her boldness was, in fact, patience. Her pride was, in fact, dignity. The mothers, at first suspicious, began to change. They saw their children coming home, not caked in mud, but full of words. They began to leave gifts for her on the trail to the cabin: a jar of preserves, a fresh-baked loaf of bread, a set of worn, but clean, wool blankets. They did not invite her to their socials, but they respected her. She was the teacher. By the time the first snow fell, the cabin was finished. It was small, just one room, but the roof was sound. The chimney drew true, and the new, small window let in the pale winter light. Mason had built a bed frame in the corner, and a strong, sturdy table with 2 chairs. It was a home. It was the first true home either of them had ever known. In the long, dark evenings, the world outside frozen and silent, they would sit by the fire. Mason would oil his tack, the smell of the leather and the neat's foot oil filling the warm room. Josephine, her hands no longer raw but calloused, would sit at the table, and she began to write. She had traded a pouch of dried herbs for a stack of paper and a bottle of ink. At first, she just wrote down her lessons for the children, but then she started to write for herself. She wrote about the wind. She wrote about the mountains. And then, slowly, she began to write her story. She did not write about Earl. She did not write about the violence. She wrote about a woman who had been told her voice was a sin. She wrote about a woman who had learned to speak. She titled it, "The Woman Who Spoke Too Much." Mason would watch her. He would sit in his chair, pretending to read an old newspaper, but his eyes would be on her. He watched her face, the way she would frown in concentration, the small smile when she found the right word. He saw the peace it brought her. One Saturday, he came back from town not with nails, but with wood, smooth, clear planks of pine. For 3 nights, after his work at the livery, he stayed up late, working by the light of the fire. He planed, he sawed, he sanded. His scarred hands, so strong with the horses, were surprisingly careful, surprisingly gentle. On the 3rd night, he stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "Josephine," he said. She looked up from the table. He brought it over and set it in the corner, by the window, where the morning light would be best. It was a writing desk. It was simple. It had 4 sturdy legs, a smooth, wide top, and a small drawer. It was not fancy. It was not polished, but it was perfect. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She walked over to it, her hand tracing the smooth grain of the wood. "Mason," she whispered, her throat thick. "A woman needs a place to do her work," he mumbled, looking embarrassed. His face turned toward the fire. She touched the side of the desk, and she felt it. He had carved her initials into the wood. Not J.W., not the brand of the man who had tried to own her, just J of Josephine Finch. He had given her back her name. She did not thank him. She did not cry. She simply walked over to him, stood on her toes, and kissed him. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the barn. It was slow. It was warm. It was a kiss of peace, a kiss of thanks. It was a kiss that promised a lifetime. That night, they sat by the fire, the cabin secure against the wind. The silence was comfortable, the rhythm of their life together settled and sure. Josephine was running her hands over the arms of her chair, her mind far away. "Mason?" she asked, her voice soft.
he replied, packing tobacco into his pipe. "Do you ever miss it?" He paused, the pipe halfway to his mouth. "Miss what?"
"Being a soldier," she said. "The war, the life you had before.
He understood. Before the prison, before the limp, before her. He struck a match, the sulfur flaring, lighting his scarred, familiar face. He drew on the pipe, the tobacco glowing like a small, red coal. He blew out a cloud of sweet-smelling smoke. He looked at her, his eyes steady, clear in the firelight. "Josephine," he said, his voice quiet. "I miss nothing but you when you are gone." The words settled over her, as warm and as heavy as the blue wool blanket. All his pain, his past, his old identity. It was all dust. She was his home. A slow smile spread across her face. It was a real smile, one that reached her eyes, one that crinkled their corners. The bruises were long gone. The fear was a distant echo. She leaned her head back against the chair, looking into the fire. "They said I was too bold," she whispered, the words no longer an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. Mason set his pipe down on the hearth. He rose from his chair, his limp barely noticeable in the small room, and knelt beside her. He took her calloused hand in his own. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his face buried in her short, soft hair. "You're bold for me, too," he replied, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so you can connect with other folks in our community. And please, subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.